Okay, so picture this. It's 1916. The world is tearing itself apart in the First World War, and Vladimir Lenin, living in exile in Zurich, writes this short, dense little book. He wasn't just trying to describe a political policy. No, he was trying to outline an entire economic stage of history. He called it Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. And what he laid out was a kind of blueprint for the massive economic forces that he saw reshaping the entire globe. So today, let's try to unpack it.
But here's where it gets really interesting. This book wasn't just a dry economic analysis. It was actually a coded message. You see, it was written to be published legally back in Russia, which meant it had to get past the Tsar's ever-watchful censors. So Lenin couldn't just come out and say what he really meant. Instead, he had to use what he called an accursed Aesopeian language, a language of hints, fables, and allegories. He was essentially smuggling a radical political argument inside a book that looked like a straightforward economic text.
So to really get what he's building up to, we've got to follow his train of thought step by step. First, we'll look at the context of this whole coded message thing. Then we'll build his case rung by rung, just like he did. We'll see how free competition, in his view, turns into monopoly. Then how banks go from being simple middlemen to major power brokers. That leads to the birth of this thing called finance capital. And from there, we'll see how this new force starts to divide up the world, which finally brings us to his big, 5-part definition of imperialism.
All right, so first things first, let's really set the scene. It's 1916. You can't just publish revolutionary material in Tsarist Russia. You'd be banned, probably arrested. So if Lenin wanted his ideas to actually reach people legally, he had to be clever. He had to build an argument that, at least on the surface, looked purely academic and totally above board.
And this is where his strategy was, frankly, kind of brilliant. He couldn't cite other revolutionaries. That'd be an instant red flag. So instead, he built his entire case using the capitalists' own data. He pulled from mainstream economic reports, official government statistics, and he quoted established bourgeois scholars of the time. The whole idea was to use the system's own numbers to prove his point, making it almost impossible for a censor to just throw it out as propaganda. How do you argue with your own stats, right?
Okay, so let's get into the first big idea, the first rung on this ladder. The starting point for his whole argument is a direct challenge to one of the core ideas of classical capitalism. You know, the idea of free and open competition. Lenin argued that the natural, inevitable result of all that competition wasn't more competition, it was its exact opposite, monopoly.
So here's the claim, plain and simple. As capitalism matures, production and wealth are going to get concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. It's not an accident, it's not a bug in the system. For Lenin, it's a fundamental feature. The big fish eating the small fish is just part of the process. And to back this up, he turned to the data.
He uses Germany, which was a huge industrial power at the time, as his case study. And the numbers here show this incredibly clear trend. Look at this. In 1882, only 3 out of every 1,000 businesses were considered large, and they employed about 22% of the workers. Fast forward to 1907, and that number has tripled, 9 large businesses per 1,000, now employing almost 40% of the workforce. The trend toward fewer, bigger players was just undeniable.
And this number, wow, this really drives the point home. It wasn't just about how many people they employed. By 1907, less than 1%, 1/100th, of all companies in Germany were using more than 3/4 of all the steam and electric power, all the energy fueling the entire economy. It led him to a pretty stark conclusion, which he puts like this: tens of thousands of huge enterprises are everything. Millions of small ones are nothing.
He then maps this whole process out over time. He says, look, the 1860s and 70s, that was the peak of free competition. Monopolies were just starting to form. Then, after the big economic crash of 1873, you start seeing cartels pop up. You know, groups of companies agreeing to fix prices. But they were still kind of temporary. But by the turn of the century, after another big crisis, these cartels weren't temporary anymore. They became a basic, fundamental part of economic life. And for Lenin, this was the moment that capitalism itself had completely changed its character.
Now, this same process of concentration, fewer and bigger, wasn't just happening with factories and railroads. It was happening in the world of money too. And Lenin argues that to really understand this new stage of capitalism, you absolutely have to look at how the role of banks was changing.
You know, early on, banks were basically just middlemen. They helped businesses make payments, they moved money around, pretty simple stuff. But as industry got bigger, the banks got bigger. They started to merge and consolidate, and they transformed into these incredibly powerful monopolies that didn't just move money, they controlled it. They controlled the flow of capital, deciding who gets loans and who doesn't, and on what terms.
And once again, he brings the receipts with German data. This chart is pretty stark.
By 1913, just 9 big banks in Berlin held almost half of all the bank deposits in the entire country. The thousands of smaller banks, all of them combined, held only about 15%. You had a tiny handful of institutions sitting right at the center of the nation's entire financial system.
So how did they get all this control? Well, one of the key tricks of the trade was something Lenin identifies as the holding system. A huge bank wouldn't necessarily have to buy a smaller bank outright. Nope, they'd just buy up a controlling share of its stock. And just like that, the smaller bank becomes part of their financial empire, a subordinate, without any messy merger.
And this system lets you build these incredible pyramids of control. You have a mother company at the very top. It controls its daughter companies through stock ownership. And then those daughter companies control the grandchild companies. As one observer at the time noted, it meant that a relatively small amount of capital at the top could be leveraged to dominate a gigantic network of firms and production.
And then this whole structure gets locked into place socially. The lines just get completely blurred. The very same people start running the banks and the big industrial companies. Bank directors get seats on the boards of steel companies, and the industrial titans get seats on the boards of the banks. It's no longer bankers and industrialists. Their interests have totally merged into one.
So what happens when you smash these two incredibly powerful forces together, the money power of the banks and the productive power of industry? Well, you get something new, a kind of hybrid power that Lenin, borrowing a term from another economist, calls finance capital.
He uses this definition from an Austrian economist named Rudolf Hilferding, and it's a really key concept. Finance capital isn't just money in a vault, and it's not just a factory. It's the two fused together. It's the capital from those giant monopolistic banks being put to work by the giant monopolistic industries. It's a whole new beast. And the logical result of concentrating this much power in one place, what do you get? Well, according to Lenin, you get a financial oligarchy, a tiny elite group, maybe a few hundred people, who, through their control of this tangled web of banks and industries, are now effectively in charge of the entire economic life of a country.
There's this amazing quote from a German financial magazine at the time that just perfectly captures the feeling of this new system. It says that corporate balance sheets were like old medieval manuscripts, where you had to scrape away the top layer of text to find the original, real story hidden underneath. That's what the holding system did. It made it so you couldn't see who really controlled what, or what risky deals were being made behind the scenes.
Okay, so up to this point, we've seen how concentration works inside one country. But the next logical step in Lenin's argument, this new supercharged finance capital, couldn't stay contained within national borders. It had to go global.
And this, for Lenin, marks a really fundamental shift. Under the old-school competitive capitalism of the 19th century, countries mostly exported goods. Britain exported textiles, things like that. But under this new monopoly stage of capitalism, the main export becomes capital itself. Instead of just selling stuff to other countries, the big powers start exporting their investments, building railroads, opening mines, and setting up factories all over the world.
And the numbers, they're just mind-boggling. Look at Great Britain. In 1862, it had about 3.6 billion francs invested abroad. By 1914, just before the war, that number had exploded to somewhere between 75 and 100 billion. And you see the same incredible growth for France and Germany. This was a totally new era of globalized finance.
So why? Why was all this money flooding out of these rich countries? Lenin's answer was that capitalism had become, in his words, overripe at home. There was a surplus of capital that just couldn't find a profitable place to be invested anymore. And he's very careful to stress, this wasn't because everyone at home had everything they needed, not at all. It was because things like raising wages for workers or investing in agriculture to help farmers would lower the rate of profit. So, this surplus capital was shipped off to what he called backward countries, where labor was cheap, land was cheap, and profits were sky high.
And this brings us to the top of the mountain. After building his case piece by piece, from monopoly to powerful banks to finance capital to the export of that capital, Lenin is finally ready to put it all together and give his full definition of what he means by imperialism. So, for Lenin, imperialism wasn't just a political choice or a preference for having colonies. It was the inevitable economic stage where all these pieces we've just talked about finally click together. It's defined by these 5 key features. You've got the monopolies we started with, then the finance capital and the oligarchy that controls it, then you have that crucial shift to exporting capital, not just goods, and finally you see this whole logic play out on a global map, with giant international corporations and the great powers literally carving up the entire planet among themselves.
And here it is. In a preface he wrote a few years later, after he was back in Russia, he finally says the quiet part out loud, the political point that was hidden in the original book. For Lenin, this highest stage of capitalism, with its giant monopolies and global conflicts over resources, wasn't going to last forever. He saw it as the final, desperate stage right before a worldwide social revolution, a prediction that, in his mind, was already coming true with the events that started unfolding in 1917.
Lenin wrote all of this over 100 years ago. He was trying to make sense of a world that was being completely transformed by a new kind of global economy. He described a system that was driven by this relentless logic of concentration and the global flow of capital. Now, obviously, the world has changed in countless ways since then, but his core ideas about monopoly, about finance, they're still at the center of so many of our debates today. And it kind of leaves us with a big question, doesn't it? How have those same forces continued to evolve, and how are they still shaping the world that we all live in right now?